The year was 1540, and behind the shining walls of Hampton Court Palace, something dark was festering. An ordeal so cruel it could make even the grimmest fairy tale sound like a bedtime story. While the nobles twirled through dances and ambassadors traded polite smiles, one woman was living through a nightmare designed by a king. Her crime wasn't treason, it wasn't betrayal. It was something far less tangible, but far more dangerous to a man like Henry VIII. She had failed to stir his desire. Anne of Cleves had crossed the sea to England as a royal bride. A living peace treaty, meant to strengthen Protestant ties and give Henry leverage against his Catholic enemies. But instead of being celebrated, she became a symbol of everything the king despised. To Henry, she wasn't a partner or a prize anymore. She was an embarrassment. A woman condemned not for what she'd done, but for what she was, born in the wrong body, at the wrong time, to a man who saw her as a mirror of his own disappointment. Now, this isn't that tidy story you might have heard about the lucky wife who kept her head. No, this is the raw, unvarnished version, the one that stinks of fear, rot, and humiliation. It's a story about a king consumed by his own decay and the woman who had to live beneath the weight of his madness. Today, I'm taking you into one of history's most twisted royal disasters. The tale of how Henry VIII turned a dignified German princess into a public joke, and how she survived by enduring indignities that would have crushed almost anyone else. By the time we're done, you'll see why Anne of Cleves isn't just another tragic name from the Tudor era. She represents something bigger, the moral rot at the very heart of Henry's England. But before we can understand the destruction of this woman's pride, we have to take a good, hard look at the monster who orchestrated it. By 1539, Henry VIII was hardly even human anymore. The once handsome athlete who dazzled Europe with his charm had become a bloated, limping shell of himself. His body was failing him. He moved with mechanical supports, and his legs oozed blood and pus beneath his fine silk stockings. The air around him carried the sour tang of decay, and courtiers had learned to breathe through their mouths whenever he passed. Modern medical experts who've studied the records paint a horrifying picture. Henry likely suffered from osteomyelitis, a brutal bone infection that left him in constant agony and filled his wounds with foul-smelling discharge. His doctors, working with the primitive understanding of the day, didn't know what to do. They wrapped his sores in bandages and dosed him with opium, clouding his mind and feeding the paranoia that already ruled his temper. The result was a man both powerful and unpredictable, a ruler whose pain had curdled into madness. But the damage went beyond his body. The infection likely disrupted his hormones, his circulation, and even his ability to perform as a man. And yet, Henry's ego was far too massive to face that truth. Instead of acknowledging his own frailty, he turned his blame outward onto his wives. Each failure of his flesh became, in his mind, a failure of theirs. He twisted medical reality into moral judgment, convincing himself that any woman who couldn't excite him was somehow defective. This was the diseased tyrant who would soon judge Anne of Cleves, casting his own corruption onto her and declaring her unworthy simply because she couldn't mend what was already broken inside him. Meanwhile, across the sea in the Duchy of Cleves, a young woman of 24 was preparing for what she believed would be the greatest role of her life, and had been brought up in the strict, orderly court of her brother Duke Wilhelm. She'd learned languages, music, and the diplomatic skills that made noble women valuable pawns in the game of power. To her, duty wasn't just a virtue, it was survival. That sense of obedience, as it turned out, would be both her saving grace and her curse in the treacherous world of Tudor politics. The stakes behind her marriage were enormous, and the political urgency that drove it can't be overstated. By the late 1530s, England was standing all alone on the European stage. The great Catholic powers, France and the Holy Roman Empire, had joined forces, and Henry's dramatic break from Rome had left him without a single dependable ally. His kingdom was teetering on the edge of diplomatic disaster. In that bleak moment, salvation seemed to lie with the Protestant states of Germany, and the key to unlocking that alliance was a young woman named Anne of Cleves. Anne's brother, Duke Wilhelm, carried serious political weight among the Lutheran princes. So, this marriage wasn't just another royal love story, It was a matter of survival. England's stability, its alliances, maybe even its independence, hung in the balance. But while diplomats haggled over treaties and dowries, something far less official was already undermining the entire plan. The king's own insecurity. The man who had once strutted through courts as Europe's golden prince now saw his body betraying him, and with every passing year, his confidence slipped a little further. Henry demanded constant reassurance that he was still the desirable man he used to be. Yet the cruel truth was that his body no longer matched his ego. That need for validation, and his inability to live up to it, turned this political marriage into a slow-motion tragedy before and had even left Germany. The first crack in the illusion came through art. Hans Holbein, Henry's trusted court painter, had been sent to capture Anne's likeness. Holbein was famous for his realism. He painted what he saw, not what people wanted him to see. His portrait showed a composed young woman, serene and dignified, dressed in the stately German fashion with her intricate headdress and modest expression. To modern eyes, she looks gentle, maybe even lovely. But to Henry, fed by endless flattery and fantasy, she was supposed to be something more, an ideal. The king pored over that painting as if it were a promise. He built fantasies in his head that no real woman could live up to. His courtiers, ever eager to please, only fueled the delusion. They spoke of Anne's flawless skin, her sparkling eyes, her noble grace. All the poetic nonsense they knew Henry wanted to hear. By the time she set sail for England, Anne wasn't a person to him anymore. She was a dream, and dreams have a way of disappointing reality. When Anne's ships finally arrived on English shores in December 1539, she carried with her not just her personal hopes, but the expectations of two entire nations. She had spent months preparing to become Queen of England, learning the customs, practicing the language, even studying new dances to please her future husband. Her dowry chests were packed full of treasures from Cleves, fine fabrics, jewels, and tokens of her family's wealth and pride. Everything was ready for a triumph. But that triumph ended the moment she met the king. The meeting at Rochester is the kind of story that makes you wince even centuries later. Henry, who fancied himself a master of romance, decided to play a little game of disguise. Dressed as a humble messenger, he barged into Anne's quarters, expecting his mystery entrance to thrill her. A gesture straight out of the old tales of courtly love. But instead of the swooning reaction he imagined, Anne looked politely confused. She didn't recognize him, and worse, she didn't play along. In her world, the structured, formal court of Germany, such behavior wasn't romantic. It was strange. That brief moment of misunderstanding sealed her fate. Henry had come seeking instant adoration, but what he found was calm civility. To a man clinging to the illusion of his own charm, her lack of excitement was an unforgivable insult. Witnesses said his face darkened immediately. Whatever affection he might have felt based on Holbein's portrait evaporated right there in that room. Political duty demanded that the marriage go forward, but emotionally, the king was already done. The whispers began almost at once. The same courtiers who had once praised Anne as the perfect match now murmured about her awkward manners, her foreign ways, her inability to please their sovereign. It wasn't gossip, it was damage control. The court was already rewriting the story to excuse the king's rejection, giving him a way to shift blame from his own failings to hers. Their wedding on January 6, 1540, might have looked like a grand celebration, but in truth it felt more like a funeral with crowns. Henry appeared magnificent in cloth of gold, trying to disguise the decay beneath the splendor, and stood beside him, radiant in her finery. But the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Diplomats in attendance strained to interpret every glance, every twitch of the king's jaw, sensing something was already terribly wrong. Through it all, Anne kept her composure. Trained from childhood to mask her emotions, she carried herself with dignity, even as humiliation simmered just below the surface. She had no idea how vicious the English court could be, or how quickly kindness could turn into cruelty. But she was about to learn. What took place after that wedding wasn't a celebration of love or alliance. It was a public unraveling, a slow-motion humiliation of a woman who'd done nothing wrong, except fail to enchant a king whose body and mind were rotting from the inside out. That night, the royal bedchamber turned into a stage of shame. The curtains closed on dignity, and what followed would define Anne's time in England. Henry, by then more corpse than king, approached the marriage bed with all the passion of a man walking to his own execution. His infected legs were wrapped in bandages that reeked through silk sheets, and as he winced from his own pain, he turned that disgust on Anne. The man who once prided himself on charm and confidence, the performer who had captivated half of Europe, now found himself impotent and enraged before a woman guilty only of being human. Unable to face his own decay, he spun a story. Henry told anyone who would listen that the queen repulsed him. He claimed she smelled strange, that her body was misshapen, that something foreign about her had dulled his masculine vigor. Every one of those lies, whispered in private and repeated in courtly gossip, chipped away at her dignity until her humiliation became entertainment. What began as a personal failure turned into a public sport, the king's courtiers feeding off scandal to mask his weakness. As Henry's condition worsened, his cruelty grew sharper, and the destruction of Anne's reputation became deliberate policy. The Tudor court, already a place where loyalty meant survival, descended into a carnival of cruelty. Within days of the wedding, the same nobles who had once flattered and now mocked her behind her back. They mimicked her German accent in exaggerated tones and ridiculed her ignorance of English customs, twisting every innocent mistake into proof that she was unfit to be queen. Even her perfume, something as harmless as a scent, became a punchline whispered behind painted fans. Her ladies-in-waiting, who were supposed to be her allies, turned informants, feeding Henry's paranoia with every trivial observation. Every sigh, every gesture, every hesitation was reported as further evidence of foreign corruption, and was trapped in a gilded cage of malice. She lived among smiling enemies, forced to endure insult after insult in silence, while her every move was scrutinized. The courtiers understood exactly what was expected of them. To stay in the king's favor, they had to echo his disgust. They competed to invent new slights, new reasons to justify the monarch's rejection. Her gowns were too German, her manners too stiff. Her very presence became an offense to English pride. None of this was random. It was performance art, orchestrated cruelty meant to rewrite the narrative and protect Henry's ego. The transformation from queen to scapegoat happened so fast it made heads spin. Within a few short weeks, Anne had become the symbol of everything wrong with foreign influence. Pamphlets began circulating, warning that German women were cold and unsuitable for English husbands. Poets composed flattering verses about the beauty and purity of English maidens, thinly veiled propaganda that made the king's annulment seem not just reasonable, but patriotic. It was all part of a carefully staged campaign to justify her downfall and cleanse the court of blame. But the worst humiliation didn't happen in public. It happened in private under the pretense of medicine. Henry ordered his physicians to examine Anne's body for evidence of the defects he claimed to see. Those examinations were nothing short of violations, disguised as royal duty. Imagine it. A foreign queen, stripped of her dignity, subjected to invasive scrutiny so her husband could prove a lie. The reports, of course, said exactly what Henry wanted them to say. Those doctor documents, no pun intended, were filed away in royal archives as proof of her unfitness. The king's doctors, terrified of challenging their patient, went along with his delusion. They suggested that Anne's Germanic humors or foreign habits had somehow disrupted Henry's natural vitality. In truth, they were protecting themselves from the wrath of a man who'd grown more unstable by the day. In Tudor England, medicine wasn't about healing, it was about politics. Diplomatic letters from that time give us glimpses of the truth. Foreign ambassadors reported that Henry's condition was worsening, that his stench was unbearable, that audiences with him required perfumed cloths and elaborate precautions. Even as the king's body decayed, and bore the blame for it, she became the face of his corruption, the scapegoat for sins she never committed. And while Anne endured her slow, public crucifixion, Henry's attention was already drifting to someone younger, softer, easier to mold. Catherine Howard, barely more than a child, became the new object of his obsession. Her youth promised everything and supposedly lacked vitality, innocence, and the illusion of a man still capable of passion. Catherine represented a kind of cruel contrast. She was young where and was mature, English where and was foreign, untested where and was worldly. Her very existence became a weapon in the king's hand, another way to remind and of her supposed inadequacy. Courtiers noticed it immediately. Whenever Catherine entered the room, Henry seemed to come alive again, his face brightening with forced charm. Around and he was cold, dismissive, a man who'd already rewritten history in his own favor. And yet, in a twist history rarely allows, and of Cleves outlived them all. When Henry finally cast her aside, she didn't crumble. She adapted. She accepted the annulment with quiet grace, earning the title the king's beloved sister, and a freedom no other wife of Henry VIII ever knew. While Catherine Howard met the axe and others met their own tragic ends, and built a peaceful life on the fringes of power, surrounded by books, gardens, and the simple dignity that had always defined her. In the end, the woman once mocked as the plain German bride became the last one standing, the calm survivor of a storm that had destroyed every soul it touched. Her story is more than a royal scandal. It's a reminder that endurance can be its own kind of victory, and that sometimes, survival is the most elegant revenge of all.